Hello, my name's Richard Rudd. I'm delighted to be here introducing you to a new book I've written. And this book's called Mrs. Blunderbuss, Human Foghorn. And obviously this is a book for adults. And I hope perhaps some children might also enjoy it. And the story behind it really is that it was written orally on the way to school. My kids are now grown and teenagers, some teenagers, and my oldest is 21. And but this was back when we were driving to school each day along the little roads here, back roads of Devon. And to keep everyone kind of occupied and upbeat, I would tell stories as I was driving. And I'd invent stories. I love inventing stories. And one that got invented and embellished, was this one, Mrs. Blunderbuss. And there were many others, actually. But this one kind of really stuck in my memory and others because of the soundscape that it delivers, which was very popular at the time because everyone could join in and make the sounds. And so without going on any further, I'm just going to read it to you. And I hope you enjoy it. And I hope that you'll introduce it to your other adult friends and perhaps even some of the children that you know. This is Blunderbuss, Human Foghorn. And it contains the most wonderful illustrations by Maisie Weston Lake, who has done an amazing job. So thank you, Maisie. Oh, and the dedication to the book as you open it is, of course, to my children, to Magnus, Ambrose, and Ursula, who helped me write this story. Mrs. Blunderbuss lived on a hill by the sea. She mended cars and drank tea. Lots of tea. Her friend, Mrs. Flittermouse, lived on the other side of the village. Mrs. Flittermouse looked after the foghorn and drank tea with Mrs. Blunderbuss. At 10 minutes to 8 every morning, Mrs. Blunderbuss put the kettle on. And at 8 o'clock every morning, the villagers put their fingers in their ears. Tea's ready, Mrs. Flittermouse! This happened every day, 6 times a day, and twice in the evenings. Except on foggy days. On foggy days, Mrs. Flittermouse couldn't come to tea because she had to work the foghorn. Woo! 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 One morning, Mrs. Blunderbuss woke up very excited. Hooray, she thought. The tea ship is arriving today. Then she looked at the clock. Talking of tea, it's time to call Mrs. Flittermouse. Mrs. Blunderbuss opened the window. Goodness, she thought. What thick fog! But why can't I hear Mrs. Flittermouse's foghorn? I'd better go and see. And Mrs. Blunderbuss marched off through the fog in search of her friend. Mrs. Blunderbuss found Mrs. Flittermouse in a flap. Thank heavens you're here, said Mrs. Flittermouse, peering through her telescope. My foghorn is broken, and the tea ship is heading straight for the rocks. What about signalling with flags? said Mrs. Blunderbuss. No, said Mrs. Flittermouse. They'll never see them in all this fog. Well, what about sending up a rocket? Said Mrs. Blunderbuss. But the rockets had gone all soggy. Mrs. Blunderbuss tried to fix the foghorn, but it was no good. It's all rusted up, she said. Oh no, wailed Mrs. Flittermouse. How can we warn the ship? I'll just have to shout then, said Mrs. Blunderbuss. She took a deep breath and shouted at the top of her voice. Mind out for the rocks! 2 miles out to sea, Ensign Benson nudged First Mate Finch. Did you hear that? Said Ensign Benson. Someone shouted, Wind up your clocks. Someone's winding us up, more like, laughed First Mate Finch. Aye, said Ensign Benson. They must think we're daft. They're still heading for the rocks, said Mrs. Flittermouse. You'll have to shout even louder. Mrs. Blunderbuss took an even deeper breath and bellowed, Watch out for the rocks! Now they're shouting, Wash out your socks, said Ensign Benson. Someone's having a laugh, said First Mate Finch. Aye, said Ensign Benson. Just ignore them. It's still no good, fretted Mrs. Flittermouse, putting in her earplugs. You'll have to shout even louder. Mrs. Blunderbuss thought for a moment. Then she picked up the funnel of the foghorn and put it over her head. Oh dear, thought Mrs. Flittermouse, she's finally lost it. But Mrs. Blunderbuss hadn't lost it. She took such a deep breath that she nearly sucked Mrs. Flittermouse into the foghorn. And then she didn't just shout. She didn't just bellow. Mrs. Blunderbuss thundered. She hollered so loudly that she blasted a hole in the fog. Rocks ahoy! There they go again, guffawed Ensign Benson, holding onto his hat. They just shouted, Box of toys! But First Mate Finch suddenly pointed. Lumber and landlubbers! Look, he declared. Galloping gangplanks, gasped Ensign Benson. They're not shouting box of toys. They're shouting Rocks ahoy! Hard a starboard! The tea-ship swerved away from the rocks in the nick of time. Splice my spinnakers, that was close, cried Captain Cuttlefish. Well spotted, lads. The sailors and the villagers had a big tea party to thank Mrs. Blunderbuss. Captain Cuttlefish gave her a lifetime supply of tea. But what about my foghorn? Fussed Mrs. Flittermouse. It'll cost a fortune to fix it. Don't worry, smiled Mrs. Blunderbuss. From now on, I'll be your foghorn. Everyone cheered. Right, said Mrs. Blunderbuss. Now who wants another cup of tea?